The week leading up to Leo's 10th birthday was, for Arthur, a period of quiet, joyful anticipation. At 72, his world had become a place of familiar routines and simple pleasures, and the upcoming celebration was a bright, shining star on his otherwise placid calendar. He had already purchased the gift, a magnificent, intricate Lego set of a starship, the kind with 1,000 tiny pieces that promised hours of shared, focused construction. He could already picture it. The two of them, heads bent together over the dining room table, the colorful plastic bricks spread out like treasure, Leo's face alight with the pure, uncomplicated joy of creation. He remembered all of Leo's birthdays. The first, a chaotic affair of cake-smeared faces and bewildered tears. The fifth, a superhero-themed party where Arthur, dressed in a slightly too tight Superman costume his wife, Emily, had sewn, had been the undisputed hero of the day. Even last year's, a smaller, more subdued gathering, had been warmed by Leo's laughter and the tight, fierce hug he'd given his grandfather at the end of the day. These were the moments that constituted the architecture of his happiness now. On Tuesday, 4 days before the party, he decided to call his son, David, to confirm the details. He wanted to know what time to arrive, what he could bring, the small logistical questions that made him feel involved, a part of the whole. "David, my boy, how are you?" he began, his voice warm. "Busy, Dad. Really busy," David replied, his tone distracted, distant. Arthur could hear the faint, rapid click of a keyboard in the background. "What's up?" "Just calling about Saturday," Arthur said cheerfully. "Leo's big day. I was just wondering what time you wanted me over. I've got his gift all wrapped and ready." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a beat of silence that felt just a little too long. "Right. The party. Look, Dad, we're still finalizing the arrangements. It's going to be a bit different this year. I'll call you back." The line went dead before Arthur could ask what he meant by different. He stood holding the receiver, a faint, cold unease beginning to creep into his cheerful anticipation. David didn't call back. An hour later, the phone rang again. It was his daughter-in-law, Karen. Her voice, unlike David's hurried distraction, was smooth, polished, and carried a distinct chill. "Arthur," she began, dispensing with any pretense of pleasantry. "David mentioned you called about the party." "Yes, Karen, I did. Just wanted to know the plan." "Well," she said, her voice taking on a patient, slightly condescending tone, the one she used when explaining things she assumed were beyond his comprehension. "David and I have been talking, and we've decided that this year the party is just going to be for the kids. You understand. Leo's getting older. He has his own friends, his own interests. It's a different dynamic now." The words were carefully chosen, wrapped in the guise of thoughtful consideration for her son's social development. But to Arthur, they were small, sharp icicles, piercing the warm bubble of his anticipation. "Oh," he said, his voice small. "I see. I wouldn't be in the way, Karen. I could just sit in the garden, watch the boys play." He could hear her sigh on the other end of the line, a sound of pure, unadulterated impatience. The mask of civility slipped. "Arthur, let's be honest with each other," she said, her voice hardening. "You're too old for this kind of thing. The noise, the loud music, a dozen 10-year-old boys running around screaming. It's not for you. You'd be bored, and frankly, the children would feel awkward having you there. You're just, well, you're boring to them. It's a party for the young." too old and boring. The phrase landed with the force of a physical blow. It knocked the air from his lungs, leaving him speechless. He was 72, not 102. He had built his own house, managed his own finances, and could still beat his son at a game of chess. But, in Karen's eyes, he'd been reduced to a caricature, a frail, dull old man who was an embarrassment, a social liability. He thought of all the times he hadn't been boring, the times he had been their on-call, unpaid babysitter, dropping his own plans at a moment's notice, the times he had been their handyman, fixing their leaky faucets and assembling their flat-pack furniture, the times he had been their silent benefactor, writing checks to cover unexpected bills, never asking to be repaid. In those moments, he had been useful. Now, at a moment of pure celebration, he was a burden. "Arthur, are you still there?" Karen's voice was sharp, impatient. He couldn't speak. The words were lodged in his throat, a thick, painful knot of shock and hurt. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, to remind her of who he was. But what was the point? She had already passed her verdict. He was irrelevant. He quietly placed the receiver back in his cradle, cutting her off mid-sentence. He stood by the phone for a long time, his hand resting on the cool plastic. The Lego starship, wrapped in bright, cheerful paper, sat on the hall table, a monument to a celebration he was no longer invited to. The silence in the house was no longer peaceful. It was the silence of rejection, the silence of being deemed worthless by his own family. The party, he now understood, was not just for the young. It was for everyone but him. The house, which had been a vessel of cheerful anticipation just an hour before, now felt like a mausoleum. Arthur sat in his armchair, the one Emily had always said was molded perfectly to the shape of his stubbornness, and stared at the opposite wall. He wasn't seeing the faded floral wallpaper. He was seeing a montage of his own life, a life he was now being told was boring. He thought of Emily. God, how he missed her. She would never have allowed this. She had been the family's heart, its fierce, loving, and uncompromising center. She would have met Karen's condescension with a look so withering it could have peeled paint. "Nonsense," she would have said. "Arthur is the least boring man I know. The party starts when he arrives." But Emily was gone, and with her, it seemed, so was his place in the family she had so carefully nurtured. His mind drifted back to their life together. They hadn't been wealthy, but their life had been rich. Their house had been a hub of activity, a place of warmth and welcome. They had hosted neighborhood cookouts, boisterous card games, and holiday dinners where the laughter was always louder than the music. He had never been boring. He had been the man who could grill the perfect steak, who told the best stories, who could make a child laugh with a simple, silly face. He had been a husband, a father, a friend, a neighbor. He had been a man who mattered. When had that changed? He began to sift through the memories of the past few years since Emily's passing, and he saw a pattern he had refused to acknowledge. It was a slow, insidious erosion of his relevance. The invitations to join David and Karen for dinner with their friends had trickled to a stop. "You wouldn't enjoy it, Dad. They're a bit loud," David had explained. The requests for his opinion on major life decisions had been replaced by announcements of decisions already made. He had learned about their new car, their kitchen renovation, their vacation plans, not in conversation, but as footnotes and phone calls about other things. He had become a function, not a family member. He was the reliable, on-call babysitter, the emergency handyman, the silent, invisible bank that could be counted on for a loan that was never intended to be repaid. He was useful when they needed him, and an inconvenience when they didn't. The rejection from the party was not an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a long, quiet campaign to push him to the margins of their lives. They had been slowly, methodically making him invisible, and he, in his grief and his desire to avoid conflict, had let them. His heart ached, not just for himself, but for Leo. He knew, with the certainty of a grandfather's love, that this was not Leo's decision. The boy adored him. He remembered, just last month, they had spent a whole Saturday in the garage building a model airplane. Leo had been completely absorbed, his small hands carefully gluing the delicate balsa wood pieces, his face a mask of intense concentration. "You know everything, Grandpa," he had said, his voice full of a genuine, uncomplicated awe that had warmed Arthur's heart. Now, that same boy was being taught a subtle, poisonous lesson, that his grandfather was someone to be ashamed of, someone to be excluded. He was being taught that love and respect are conditional, that age is a liability, that boring is a synonym for old. A slow, cold anger began to smolder in the pit of his stomach, burning through the fog of his hurt and grief. It was a righteous anger, the anger of a man who has been profoundly and unjustly wronged, too old and boring. The words echoed in his mind, no longer just an insult, but a challenge. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass of the television screen. He saw what Karen saw, a man with thinning gray hair, a face etched with the lines of time, a body that moved a little more slowly than it used to. But then he looked deeper. He saw the eyes that had witnessed the birth of his son, the hands that had built a home, the heart that had loved a woman for 50 years with a fierce and unwavering devotion. He was not a relic. He was a repository of a life well lived. He thought of Emily again. He remembered her mischievous streak, the way her eyes would sparkle when she was planning a surprise or plotting a harmless prank. She had always told him he was too serious. "Arthur," she would say, "a little bit of rebellion is good for the soul." He hadn't felt rebellious in a very long time. He had felt compliant, accommodating, quiet. He had accepted the role they had given him, the role of the quiet, helpful, and increasingly invisible old man. But as he sat there, in the crushing silence of his empty house, a new, unfamiliar feeling began to stir. It was the ghost of the young man he had once been, the man who had wooed Emily with his quick wit, the man who had taken risks, the man who had never, ever allowed anyone to tell him who he was. "Boring," he whispered to the empty room. "Old." A slow, grim smile spread across his face. It was a smile his son and daughter-in-law had never seen. "All right," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Let's see about that." The weight of his invisibility was still there, but it was no longer a crushing burden. It was a cloak, and under that cloak, a plan, audacious and brilliant, was beginning to take shape. The day after Karen's phone call was a long, gray expanse of time. Arthur moved through it like a ghost in his own home, the silence amplifying the echo of her dismissive words. He tried to read, but the letters blurred on the page. He tried to work in the garden, but his heart wasn't in it. He felt adrift, a man whose anchor to the world, his role as a grandfather, a father, a cherished family elder, had been cut. In the afternoon, seeking a mindless distraction, he sat down at his old desktop computer. He had a routine: check the weather, read the headlines on a few news sites, and then, a habit he'd developed out of a quiet, lifelong interest in architecture and community, he would browse the local real estate listings. He never intended to buy anything. He just liked to look. He liked to see how the town was changing, to imagine the lives being lived behind the front doors of the houses for sale. He typed in the name of his son's street, a leafy, affluent lane on the other side of town. He scrolled idly through the listings, his mind only half engaged. A sprawling new build with a 3-car garage, a renovated Victorian with a wraparound porch. And then he stopped. His breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer to the screen, his eyes widening in disbelief. It was the house next door to David and Karen's, the old Henderson place, a handsome 2-story colonial with a large, beautifully landscaped backyard and, most importantly, a sparkling in-ground swimming pool. The listing had just gone up that morning. Motivated sellers, the description read, relocating for work, quick close preferred. An idea, wild and preposterous, flickered to life in the back of his mind. It was so audacious, so utterly out of character for the quiet, accommodating man he had become, that he almost laughed out loud. He dismissed it immediately. It was a foolish, impulsive thought, born of hurt and anger. But the idea didn't go away. It lingered. It grew. It began to take on shape and color and sound. He pictured the scene: the quiet, boring party at his son's house, and next door, a celebration of epic proportions. Music, laughter, the splash of a swimming pool, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy. Too old and boring am I. The thought was no longer just a flicker. It was a flame. He minimized the real estate window and opened a new tab. He began to do some calculations. He was not a poor man. He and Emily had been careful, frugal people. He had worked as a civil engineer for 40 years, a steady, reliable job that had provided a comfortable, if not extravagant, life. After he retired, he had sold his small consulting firm for a modest but significant sum. He had invested that money wisely, following the advice of a trusted financial advisor, a young man who, unlike his son, always listened patiently to his questions. He pulled up his investment portfolio. The numbers on the screen surprised even him. The market had been kind over the past decade. He had more than enough. He could buy the Henderson house in cash and not even feel the pinch. The flame of his idea roared into a bonfire. This was no longer about revenge. Or perhaps it was, but it was a creative, joyful kind of revenge. It wasn't about hurting them. It was about showing them and himself who he truly was. It was about refusing to accept the small gray boring box they had tried to put him in. It was an act of profound, life-affirming rebellion. His fingers, which had been trembling with hurt just yesterday, were now steady as they moved across the keyboard. He found the name of the realtor on the listing, a woman named Sarah Chen. He picked up the phone and dialed. Sarah Chen speaking. A bright, professional voice answered. "Ms. Chen," Arthur said, his own voice calm and clear, imbued with a new, unfamiliar authority. "My name is Arthur Gable. I'm calling about the property at 124 Oakwood Lane. I'd like to make an offer." "Of course, Mr. Gable," she said. "It's a wonderful property. Are you working with an agent? Would you like to schedule a viewing?" "That won't be necessary," Arthur said. "I'm familiar with the house. I'm prepared to make an all-cash offer, 20% above your asking price." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. 20% above asking? Sir, are you serious?" "Perfectly serious," Arthur said. "But I have two conditions. First, the sale must be closed within 3 days. I understand the sellers are motivated. This should motivate them further. Second, the sale must be completely confidential. No for sale sign on the lawn, no public listings updated until after the closing. I want this to be a private transaction." He could almost hear the realtor's mind racing, calculating her commission. An all-cash offer, well above asking, with a quick private close. It was a dream scenario. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice now full of a new, profound respect. "I believe we can make that happen. I will contact the sellers immediately." He hung up the phone, his heart pounding, not with anxiety but with a thrilling, exhilarating sense of purpose. He felt more alive than he had in years. He thought of Emily, of her mischievous smile. She would have loved this. She would have been his co-conspirator, his partner in this glorious, audacious crime against dullness. He looked at the wrapped Lego set on the hall table. The party was on Saturday. Today was Tuesday. He had 4 days. 4 days to buy a house, plan a party, and prepare for the most important performance of his life. He was no longer the invisible man. He was the architect of a grand, beautiful, and entirely unexpected new reality, and he couldn't wait to see the look on their faces when the curtain went up. The next 72 hours were a blur of focused, clandestine activity. Arthur, who had spent the last few years moving at the gentle, unhurried pace of a retiree, was now a man possessed by a mission. He operated with the precision of a general planning a surprise attack, his quiet house transformed into a secret command center. The call from Sarah Chen came on Wednesday morning. "Mr. Gable," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement, "the sellers have accepted your offer. They were ecstatic. We can close on Friday morning. My office will handle all the paperwork. We just need you to wire the funds." Arthur felt a surge of triumph. The first and most crucial part of his plan was in place. He spent the rest of the morning on the phone with his financial advisor, arranging the transfer of funds. The advisor, a pragmatic man named Peterson, was slightly taken aback by the sudden, large withdrawal. "A new house, Arthur? That's wonderful," he said. "I didn't know you were planning to move." "It's more of a project," Arthur replied cryptically. "A short-term investment in joy." With the house secured, he moved on to the next phase, planning the party. He didn't want just a party. He wanted an event, a spectacle, a carnival of delights that would be impossible to ignore. He sat at his kitchen table with a notepad and began to make a list, a grin spreading across his face as he wrote. First, the attractions. He went online and found a company called Epic Party Rentals. He scrolled through their offerings, his eyes lighting up. He booked their largest, most elaborate, inflatable bouncy castle, a magnificent, multi-turreted structure that looked like something out of a fairy tale. He added a professional-grade popcorn machine, a vintage-style cotton candy cart, and a snow cone maker. Next, the entertainment. He hired a magician, a man named Magnifico Mel, whose website was full of glowing testimonials from children's parties. He booked a DJ, a young woman who specialized in family-friendly, high-energy playlists. And for the grand finale, he contacted a local pyrotechnics company and arranged for a small but spectacular fireworks display to be set off just after sunset. The most delicate part of the plan was the invitations. He couldn't simply invite the children of his son's neighborhood. He needed to ensure that the guests at Leo's official party would be drawn away. He needed Leo's own friends. He found the solution in his grandson's old school yearbook, which he had kept from a few years back. He cross-referenced the names with a local online directory, a task that required a bit of digital sleuthing he hadn't realized he was capable of. By late afternoon, he had a list of phone numbers for the parents of 10 of Leo's closest friends. He began to make the calls, his voice a careful blend of friendly and mysterious. "Hello, Mrs. Davis. My name is Arthur. I'm a friend of the Miller family," he would begin. "We're planning a special surprise party for Leo's 10th birthday on Saturday, and we were hoping Michael could come." He explained the location, the house right next door to the Millers. He explained the time, starting at 3 o'clock, exactly when the official party was scheduled to begin. And he explained the most crucial element. "Now, this is a big surprise," he would say, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Leo doesn't know about it, and neither do his parents. We're hoping to sneak all the kids over for the big reveal. So, if you could just drop Michael off at the side gate of 124 Oakwood Lane, that would be wonderful. And please, not a word to David or Karen. We want to see the look on their faces." The parents were, without exception, intrigued. The idea of a secret, surprise party orchestrated by a mysterious family friend was far more exciting than a standard backyard barbecue. They all agreed, promising to keep the secret. On Friday morning, Arthur went to the lawyer's office and signed the final papers. The house was officially his. He picked up the keys from Sarah Chen, who handed them to him with a curious, respectful smile. "Enjoy your project, Mr. Gable," she said. He didn't go to his new house immediately. He went shopping. He bought the Lego Starship, of course, but he didn't stop there. He went to an electronics store and purchased the latest gaming console, a massive, flat-screen television, and a comfortable gaming chair. This would be the centerpiece of the game room he was planning. Finally, late on Friday afternoon, he drove to his new property. He let himself in, the click of the key in the lock a deeply satisfying sound. The house was empty, the rooms echoing with the ghosts of the previous owners' lives. But to Arthur, it was a blank canvas. He spent the evening directing a flurry of activity. The party rental company arrived and set up the bouncy castle in the sprawling backyard. The DJ delivered her equipment. A catering company he had hired dropped off coolers filled with drinks and boxes of pizza. He designated one of the empty bedrooms as the game room and set up the new television and console. He placed the wrapped Lego set on a table in the center of the room, a silent, powerful statement. By the time he left that night, locking the door behind him, everything was in place. The stage was set. The props were in position. All that was missing were the actors. He drove back to his own quiet, empty house and slept more soundly than he had in years. He was no longer a man waiting for an invitation. He was the host of a party that no one, least of all his own family, would ever forget. He was, he thought with a final, mischievous smile before drifting off to sleep, anything but boring. Saturday dawned bright and clear, a perfect late spring day. Arthur woke early, a nervous, excited energy thrumming in his veins. He dressed not in his usual retiree uniform of soft slacks and a polo shirt, but in crisp linen trousers and a vibrant, tropical print shirt he hadn't worn in years. It was Emily's favorite, a shirt she had called his party shirt. It felt appropriate. He drove to his new house at noon, parking his car a few blocks away to avoid suspicion. He let himself in and did a final check. Everything was perfect. The bouncy castle stood in the backyard, a magnificent, silent behemoth of red and blue vinyl. The popcorn and cotton candy machines were plugged in, ready to go. The coolers were stocked. The game room was a 10-year-old's dream. He took up his position in a comfortable lounge chair on the back patio, a tall glass of iced tea in his hand, and waited. Next door, at David and Karen's house, the official party was getting underway. Arthur could hear the faint, tinny sound of pop music from a small Bluetooth speaker. He could see a few sad-looking balloons tied to the mailbox. It was a party born of obligation, and it had the joyless, perfunctory air to match. He watched as Leo's friends began to arrive. Their parents would drop them off at the front door of David and Karen's house, then, after a few moments, discreetly drive away. Arthur knew that most of them were simply circling the block, waiting for the real party to begin. He saw his grandson, Leo, in the backyard. The boy was listlessly kicking a soccer ball against the fence, his shoulders slumped. He looked lonely. He looked sad. He was the guest of honor at a party that felt more like a punishment. Arthur's resolve, which had been wavering slightly with a pang of guilt, hardened again into steel. He was doing the right thing. At precisely 3 o'clock, he gave the signal. The DJ, a young woman with bright pink hair, pushed a button on her console. Suddenly, the quiet suburban afternoon was filled with the sound of a vibrant, thumping beat, a sound that was impossible to ignore. The magician, Magnifico Mel, began his warm-up act on the lawn, pulling a string of colorful scarves from his empty hat. The air began to fill with the irresistible, sugary scent of fresh popcorn and cotton candy. The effect was instantaneous. Next door, the listless soccer game came to an abrupt halt. Leo and his friends froze, their heads turning in unison toward the fence, their eyes wide. They looked like meerkats sensing a distant, exciting predator. Arthur watched as they crept toward the tall wooden fence that separated the two properties. He could see their small faces peering through the gaps in the boards. Their expressions were a mixture of awe, disbelief, and pure, unadulterated longing. One boy, braver than the rest, scrambled onto a lawn chair to get a better look. "Whoa!" he shouted. "They have a bouncy castle, a huge one." Another boy followed. "And a magician. And, is that a snow cone machine?" Leo was the last to look. He climbed onto the swing set, his small face a mask of confusion and wonder. He saw the party, the music, the food, the sheer, unadulterated joy of it all. And then he saw his grandfather, sitting in a lounge chair by the pool, raising his glass of iced tea in a silent, welcoming toast. Their eyes met across the fence. A slow, wondrous smile spread across Leo's face. He understood. The exodus began. It started with one boy who mumbled an excuse to Karen about needing to use the bathroom, then made a beeline for the side gate. A few moments later, 2 more followed. Then another. Karen, who had been inside arranging a plate of limp carrot sticks, came out to see her party dissolving before her eyes. "Boys, where are you going?" she called out, her voice sharp with irritation. "Just gonna see what's happening next door," one of them shouted back, not even bothering to stop. Within 15 minutes, the backyard of David and Karen's house was empty. The sad balloons drooped in the afternoon sun. The Bluetooth speaker played to an audience of one, a squirrel who was cautiously approaching the abandoned plate of carrot sticks. The only guest who remained was Leo. He stood in the middle of the lawn, looking from his parents, who were now standing on their back porch with expressions of stunned disbelief, to the vibrant, joyful chaos unfolding next door. Then, with a look of quiet, determined rebellion on his face, he began to walk toward the fence. "Leo, where do you think you're going?" David demanded, his voice a low growl. Leo didn't answer. He simply walked to the gate, unlatched it, and stepped through into his grandfather's yard. He ran across the lawn, his earlier sadness completely forgotten, and threw his arms around Arthur's legs. "Grandpa," he shouted, his voice full of a joy that was more beautiful than any music, "this is the best birthday party in the entire world." Arthur looked over his grandson's head at the two figures standing on the porch next door. He saw his son and his daughter-in-law, their faces a mixture of fury, humiliation, and utter, complete bewilderment. He gave them a small, polite wave, a gesture that was both a greeting and a declaration of victory. The boring old man had just thrown the party of the year, and he had stolen every single one of their guests. For a moment, David and Karen stood frozen on their back porch, paralyzed by a mixture of rage and disbelief. They watched as their son, the guest of honor at their own meticulously planned, if underwhelming, party, was swallowed up by the joyous, chaotic celebration next door. The sound of his laughter, loud and carefree, drifted across the fence, a sound they hadn't heard all day, a sound that now felt like a personal insult. The spell was broken by Karen. Her face, which had been a mask of stunned confusion, hardened into a tight, furious knot. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her voice a low, dangerous whisper. She turned to David. "Are you going to do something, or are you just going to stand there?" Galvanized into action, David stormed down the steps and across the lawn, his face a thundercloud. He yanked open the gate that separated the two properties and strode into Arthur's backyard as if he were leading a military charge. Karen followed a step behind, her arms crossed tightly, her eyes scanning the scene with undisguised contempt. They found Arthur exactly where they had last seen him, sitting in his lounge chair by the pool, a picture of serene, unbothered contentment. He was surrounded by a swarm of happy, laughing 10-year-olds. Leo was at his side, his face smeared with blue snow cone syrup, his eyes shining. "Dad!" David's voice was a roar that momentarily silenced the music. The children stopped their playing, turning to look at the angry man who had just crashed their party. "What in the world do you think you're doing?" Arthur looked up from his conversation with Leo, his expression one of mild, polite surprise. "David, Karen, how nice of you to join us. Can I offer you a snow cone? The cherry is particularly good." "Don't play dumb with me," David snapped, his face turning a blotchy red. "You bought this house? You planned all of this circus, just to humiliate us?" "Humiliate you?" Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Why would you feel humiliated? I'm just throwing a party. I was feeling a bit, not boring. I was told that parties were for the young, but as you can see, He gestured to the children, who were now watching the exchange with wide, curious eyes. "The young don't seem to mind my company." Karen stepped forward, her voice dripping with venom. "This is petty, Arthur. Incredibly petty and childish. You're supposed to be the adult here." "I am being the adult," Arthur replied calmly. "I am demonstrating that one's value is not determined by one's age. I am teaching my grandson that joy is not something to be rationed or controlled. And I am enjoying my own property, which, as I recall, is a perfectly adult thing to do." It was at that moment that Leo, who had been listening to the exchange with a growing sense of unease, stepped in front of his grandfather, his small body a defiant shield. "Leave him alone," he said, his voice small but firm. He looked directly at his parents. "You were mean to him. You told him he was boring." The public accusation, delivered in the clear, unwavering voice of their own son, struck David and Karen with the force of a physical blow. The other children began to whisper amongst themselves. "Leo, this is a grown-up conversation," Karen said, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "No," Leo insisted, his chin jutting out. "It's about Grandpa, and it's my birthday, and this is the best party ever. Grandpa isn't boring. You're boring." The brutal, honest verdict of a 10-year-old hung in the air. David looked from his son's defiant face to his father's calm, unreadable one, and he felt a wave of helpless fury. He had lost control. He had been outmaneuvered, outsmarted, and publicly shamed by the two people he had sought to control. "This is unacceptable," he sputtered, searching for some ground to stand on. "You've undermined our authority as parents. You've deliberately created a scene." "I believe," Arthur said, his voice cutting through his son's blustering, "that you are the one creating a scene. You're a guest at my party, and frankly, you're upsetting the other children. Now, you have two choices. You can either grab a plate, have some pizza, and try to enjoy your son's birthday, or you can leave." He looked at them, his gaze steady and unflinching. The message was clear. This was his house, his party, his rules. Defeated, humiliated, and utterly powerless, David and Karen turned and walked back through the gate, the sound of the children's renewed laughter following them like a mocking chorus. They retreated to their own quiet, empty backyard, leaving their son in the care of the old, boring man who had just taught them a lesson they would never forget. Arthur watched them go, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. This was not the victory he had wanted. He had wanted a family, but if he couldn't have their love, he would, at the very least, command their respect. He turned back to his grandson, a warm smile replacing his stern expression. "Now," he said, "I believe Magnifico Mel is about to saw a rabbit in half. Shall we go and see?" Leo grinned, his earlier defiance replaced by pure, unadulterated joy. He took his grandfather's hand, and together they walked back into the heart of the party, leaving the quiet, empty house next door to its own self-inflicted silence. The party raged on, a bubble of pure, unadulterated joy in the quiet suburban afternoon. The fireworks, as promised, were spectacular, a series of brilliant, glittering explosions that painted the twilight sky. The children, their faces sticky with sugar and alight with wonder, cheered with every burst of color. From his lounge chair, Arthur watched them, a quiet, satisfied smile on his face. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. Next door, however, the silence was thick with unspoken accusations. David and Karen sat in their pristine, modern kitchen, the sounds of the party a constant, infuriating reminder of their public humiliation. They didn't speak. They just stared at the walls, at the floor, at anything but each other. When the last of the children had been picked up by their parents, many of whom cast curious, speculative glances toward David and Karen's dark house, Leo finally returned. He walked into the kitchen, his face flushed with happiness, a half-eaten bag of popcorn in his hand. "That was the best birthday ever," he announced to the silent room. Karen finally snapped. "Don't you speak to us about that spectacle," she hissed. "Your grandfather deliberately tried to embarrass us." Leo's smile faded. He looked at his mother, his expression one of genuine confusion. "But he was just being fun," he said. "You guys said he was boring. He's not. He's the most fun person I know." "Go to your room, Leo," David said, his voice a low, tired growl. Leo, his happy bubble burst, turned and trudged up the stairs, leaving his parents alone again in their sterile, silent kitchen. Later that evening, after the party debris had been cleared away by the catering company and the house next door had fallen silent, David walked back over. He found his father sitting on the back patio, nursing a small glass of brandy and looking up at the stars. David didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, a silhouette against the lighted doorway. "Why, Dad?" he finally asked, his voice raw. "Why did you have to do it like that? So public, so humiliating." Arthur turned his head slowly. "Because you didn't leave me any other way to be heard," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I have spent the last 5 years trying to talk to you, to connect with you, and you have treated me like a piece of old furniture. You have made me invisible. You don't listen to words, David, but you listen to actions. So, I acted." "You made us look like fools," David muttered. "You made yourselves look like fools," Arthur corrected him gently. "You told your own father he was too old and boring to celebrate his grandson's birthday. What did you expect me to do? Sit in my quiet little house and knit? That's the man you wanted me to be, but that's not the man I am." He took a sip of his brandy. "I love you, David, but I don't like the man you've become. You're so concerned with appearances, with what other people think, that you've forgotten what's actually important. You've forgotten how to have fun. You've forgotten how to love without conditions." David sank into the chair opposite his father, the fight completely gone out of him. "Karen, she's furious," he said. "She wants to sell the house. She says she can't live next door to you after this." Arthur shrugged. "That's her choice," he said. "But you have a choice to make too, son. You can continue to live your life according to her cold, narrow rules, or you can decide to be the man you were meant to be. The man who used to laugh at my terrible jokes. The man who used to believe in a little bit of magic." They sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the chirping of the crickets in the darkness. "The house," David said finally. "Are you really going to live here?" "I am," Arthur said. "I've decided I rather like being the fun neighbor. And Leo, he deserves to have a place where he can come and just be a kid. A place where no one is going to tell him he's being too loud or too messy." He looked at his son, his expression softening. "And you're welcome here too, David. Any time. Not as the man who is embarrassed by his old father, but just as my son. The door is always open." David didn't respond. He just sat there, his head in his hands, a man caught between two worlds, the cold, sterile world he had built with his wife, and the warm, chaotic, joyful world his father had just created next door. He eventually stood up and walked back to his own house without another word. Arthur watched him go, a profound sadness in his heart. He had won the battle, but he was not sure if he had won back his son. That, he knew, would be a much longer and much more difficult fight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like he had the strength for it. Arthur did not sell the house next door. He settled into it, a quiet, cheerful, and slightly eccentric presence on the manicured suburban street. He became the new neighbor, a title he found endlessly amusing. The house itself transformed under his care. He turned the formal dining room into a workshop, where he and Leo spent hours building intricate model rockets and elaborate train sets. The pristine, modern living room became a comfortable den, filled with oversized armchairs, shelves overflowing with books, and a state-of-the-art sound system that was often used to play the rock and roll music of his youth at a volume that made the neighbors' windows rattle. The backyard, however, was the true heart of his new kingdom. The swimming pool was always open. The bouncy castle, which he had decided to purchase outright, was inflated every weekend. He installed a permanent, professional-grade barbecue pit and a small, charmingly rustic pizza oven. His house became the unofficial headquarters for Leo and his friends. It was the place they came after school, the place they spent their weekends. It was a haven of joyful, chaotic energy, a place where the only rule was to have fun. Arthur presided over it all with a quiet, benevolent grace. He was not just a grandfather. He was the king of a small, happy kingdom of 10-year-old boys. The situation next door, however, was far from happy. As David had predicted, Karen could not stand the humiliation. The constant sound of laughter and music from Arthur's yard was a grating reminder of her public defeat. The fact that her own son preferred to spend all his free time at his grandfather's house was a source of constant, bitter resentment. Their marriage, which had been built on a foundation of shared social ambition and material desire, began to crumble under the strain. David, caught in the middle, was a changed man. The confrontation with his father had shaken him to his core. He began to see his life, his marriage, his values through a new, unflattering lens. He started spending less time at the office and more time at home, but he found little comfort there. The silence in his own house was a stark contrast to the vibrant life next door. He began to visit his father, at first tentatively, then with increasing frequency. He would come over in the evenings after Leo was in bed, and they would sit on the patio much as they had on the night of the party. They didn't talk about Karen. They didn't talk about the past. They talked about books, about politics, about the simple, everyday things they had not discussed in years. Slowly, tentatively, they began to rebuild their relationship. It was not the same as it had been. It was quieter, more honest, built on a new foundation of mutual respect. David began to see his father not as a burden or a relic, but as a man of quiet strength, deep integrity, and a surprising, delightful capacity for joy. The end came 6 months after the party. David arrived at Arthur's house one evening, his face pale and drawn. "She's leaving me," he said, his voice flat. "She's filed for divorce. She said she can't live in a world where she's not in control." Arthur nodded slowly. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply poured his son a glass of brandy and sat with him in companionable silence. The final scene takes place a year after the infamous birthday party. It is Leo's 11th birthday. The party, once again, is at Arthur's house. It is just as loud, just as chaotic, just as joyful as the year before. Arthur is at the grill, a ridiculous kiss-the-cook apron tied around his waist. Leo and his friends are playing in the pool, and standing next to Arthur, helping him flip the burgers, is David. He is smiling, a genuine, relaxed smile that Arthur has not seen on his face in over a decade. Karen is gone. The house next door has been sold. David and Leo have moved into a smaller, more modest house a few blocks away. But they're here, at Arthur's house, almost every day. Leo runs up from the pool, dripping water on the patio. "Grandpa, Dad, the burgers are burning," he yells, laughing. David laughs with him. "Your grandfather is a terrible cook," he says, ruffling his son's wet hair. "He always has been." Arthur smiles, a deep, contented smile. He looks at his son and his grandson, at the two men in his life, standing together in the warm afternoon sun. He is no longer invisible. He is the heart of his family, the center of their world. He winks at Leo. "Don't listen to him, son," he says, his eyes twinkling. "I may be old, but I'm anything but boring." And as the three of them stand there, laughing together, the sound of their shared joy is the sweetest victory of all.